What if everything you learned about the American Revolution was only half the story? What if it wasn't just heroic patriots versus a tyrant king, but a brutal civil war between neighbors, a revolution that nearly collapsed in freezing winters? A fight funded and decided by foreign empires, a declaration of equality written in a land where slavery still thrived. Tonight, we uncover the real story textbooks soften, the fear, the betrayal, the global politics, and the dangerous gamble that could have ended in total failure. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you won't see the American Revolution the same way again. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. There is a version of the American Revolution most of us were taught. It is clean, orderly, heroic. In that version, brave patriots stand against tyranny, muskets flash at Lexington, liberty rings in Philadelphia, and a new nation rises, almost inevitably, into the light. But history is rarely that simple. The American Revolution was not just a war of ideals. It was a civil war between neighbors. It was a gamble that could have ended in public hangings. It was a struggle stained by contradiction, liberty proclaimed in a land where slavery endured. And it was held together not by myth, but by fragile human courage. Tonight, we step beyond the marble statues and into the beating heart of a revolution textbooks often simplify. The war was a family fight. When the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, it was not simply America versus Britain. It was American against American. Nearly one-third of colonists remained loyal to the crown. These loyalists were not villains in redcoats. They were shopkeepers, farmers, Anglican clergy, people who feared chaos more than taxes. In cities like New York City, loyalist sentiment ran strong. Families divided. Brothers fought brothers. Churches split. Property was seized. Neighbors whispered accusations of treason. The revolution did not unite America at first, it fractured it. And that fracture left scars long after the muskets fell silent. The revolution nearly collapsed. We remember George Washington crossing the Delaware as if victory were preordained. It was not. In the winter of 1776, the revolution teetered on the edge of extinction. The Continental Army was retreating. Enlistments were expiring. Soldiers lacked shoes, coats, even food. Disease stalked the camps more relentlessly than British bayonets. At Valley Forge, men froze. They bled into the snow. They buried friends in shallow graves. Washington himself feared the cause might die. The secret textbooks rarely emphasizes this. The revolution survived not because victory was certain, but because ordinary men endured extraordinary hardship for an idea not yet realized. Liberty was fragile. It had to be chosen again and again in hunger and despair. 3. The revolution was global. We often imagine the war confined to 13 colonies. But the American Revolution became a world war. The turning point at Battle of Saratoga convinced Louis XVI to gamble on the American cause. French ships, soldiers, and gold transformed the conflict. Spain and the Dutch Republic would follow. Without French naval power at Siege of Yorktown, the war might have dragged on or been lost entirely. The revolution was not won by colonial grit alone. It was shaped by European rivalries, by global trade, by empires calculating advantage. Independence was both an act of courage and an outcome of geopolitics. On July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, a document was adopted that declared all men are created equal, and yet many of the men who signed it owned slaves. The revolution ignited hope among enslaved African Americans. Some joined the British, who promised freedom. Others fought for the Patriot cause, believing liberty might one day include them. For Native American nations, the revolution was not a war for freedom. It was a disaster. Many tribes allied with the British, hoping to slow colonial expansion. When Britain lost, they lost their buffer. Westward expansion accelerated. Textbooks often frame the revolution as the birth of freedom. In truth, it was also the beginning of unresolved moral struggles that would echo through the Civil War and beyond. The revolution proclaimed equality. The nation would spend centuries trying to live up to it. The fragile peace that followed. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, independence was secured, but unity was not. The new nation staggered under debt. States quarreled. The Articles of Confederation proved weak. Some wondered if the experiment had already failed. It would take another gathering in Philadelphia, this time in 1787, to draft a constitution strong enough to bind a fragile republic together. The revolution did not end with victory at Yorktown. It continued in debates, compromises, and the steady work of self-government. VI. The real secret: it was uncertain. Perhaps the greatest secret textbooks miss is this: the American Revolution was not inevitable. At every turn, it could have collapsed into defeat, into dictatorship, into fragmentation. It survived because flawed human beings, ambitious, fearful, courageous, contradictory, chose restraint when they could have seized power. When some officers urged Washington to become king, he refused. That refusal may have been as revolutionary as any battlefield victory. The true miracle of the Revolution was not that it declared independence. It was that it surrendered power to the people and survived the surrender. Conclusion: the Revolution is still unfinished. The American Revolution is not merely a chapter in a textbook. It is an ongoing argument about liberty and equality, about who belongs, about how power should be restrained, about whether ideals can overcome human weakness. The founders were not demigods. They were men of their time, capable of brilliance and blind spots alike. The soldiers were not symbols. They were cold, hungry, afraid, and determined. The Revolution was messy, divided, incomplete, and that is precisely why it matters. Because it reminds us that democracy is not born perfect. It is built painfully, imperfectly, courageously, by people willing to risk everything for principles not yet fully realized. The real American Revolution was not a myth of inevitable triumph. It was a gamble on the possibility that ordinary people could govern themselves. And every generation since has been asked the same question: will we be equal to that gamble? When we speak of the American Revolution, we often imagine a unified people rising together against a distant king. We picture farmers and merchants standing shoulder to shoulder, bound by shared outrage, marching toward liberty with a single purpose. But the truth is far more unsettling, far more human. The American Revolution was not simply a war between colonies and empire. It was a civil war that tore through towns, churches, and families. It was neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, loyalty against rebellion. In the spring of 1775, when musket fire cracked across the fields at Lexington and Concord, the shots did not merely signal the beginning of resistance to British authority. They exposed a fracture already running deep within colonial society. For years, tension had simmered over taxation, representation, and imperial control. Yet disagreement did not neatly divide along geographic lines. It ran through living rooms and across dinner tables. In many communities, outspoken patriots lived beside committed loyalists. Both believed they were defending order, protecting their families, preserving what was right. Roughly 1/3 of the colonial population remained loyal to the British Crown. Another third leaned toward independence. The rest hovered uneasily in between, waiting to see which side would prevail. The Revolution was not a unanimous uprising. It was a struggle for allegiance. In cities like New York City, Loyalist sentiment was strong. Merchants who depended on imperial trade feared economic ruin. Anglican clergy warned that rebellion invited chaos and divine judgment. Enslaved people listened carefully to British promises of freedom in exchange for service. For many, loyalty to the crown was not treachery but prudence. Patriot committees enforced their cause with increasing intensity. Suspected loyalists were shamed, fined, or imprisoned. Homes were searched. Businesses were boycotted. In some towns, men accused of loyalty to Britain were tarred and feathered, paraded through streets as warnings to others. Property was confiscated under new state laws once independence was declared. Families who had lived for generations in the colonies suddenly found themselves labeled enemies. In the countryside, militias formed not only to resist British troops, but to monitor neighbors. Old grudges took on political meaning. Personal disputes merged with ideological conflict. A quarrel over land boundaries could become an accusation of disloyalty. A disagreement at church could evolve into a denunciation before a local committee. The Revolution created space for both courage and cruelty. The violence was not abstract, it was intimate. Loyalist militias and patriot forces skirmished across the Carolinas and New York's Mohawk Valley. In the South especially, the war resembled a bitter internal conflict more than a clean fight against red-coated regulars. Raids destroyed farms, crops were burned. Civilians were caught in reprisals. Retaliation followed retaliation in a grim cycle that blurred the line between soldier and civilian. For Native American nations, the civil dimension of the conflict was even more complex. Many tribes allied with Britain, believing that imperial authorities might restrain colonial expansion westward. When war spread across the frontier, indigenous communities faced devastating campaigns from patriot forces determined to break British-aligned alliances. The Revolution fractured native confederacies just as it divided colonial society. The experience of enslaved African Americans revealed another layer of division. Lord Dunmore's 1775 proclamation offered freedom to enslaved men who joined British forces. Thousands fled Patriot masters in pursuit of that promise. Others served the American cause, hoping revolutionary rhetoric might eventually lead to emancipation. The Revolution was not a single struggle for liberty, but competing visions of freedom, survival, and security. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 gave language to the Patriot cause, but it did not end internal division. In many regions, Loyalists quietly aided British armies with intelligence and supplies. When British forces occupied cities, Loyalists emerged from caution into public support. When the army withdrew, they often fled with it, fearing retribution. At the war's end, tens of thousands of Loyalists left the newly independent United States for Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean. They carried with them stories of exile and loss, convinced that the Revolution had betrayed the stability they valued. The Civil War nature of the conflict left emotional wounds that lingered long after the Treaty of Paris. Confiscated estates changed hands. Old friendships never recovered. Churches split permanently. In some towns, the memory of who had stood on which side became a quiet inheritance passed from one generation to the next. And yet, within this division lay a paradox. The Revolution forced Americans to confront the question of consent in the most personal way imaginable. It was no longer a distant philosophical debate about parliamentary sovereignty. It was a choice made at the level of the household. Would one support rebellion or remain loyal to established authority? Would one risk everything for the promise of self-government or cling to the protections of empire? There was no easy answer. Loyalists were not simply cowards or villains. Many feared that independence would unleash mob rule, economic collapse, or endless war. Patriots were not uniformly virtuous. Some were motivated by genuine devotion to liberty, others by ambition, resentment, or opportunity. Human motives mixed and overlapped. The American Revolution's identity as a civil war reminds us that independence was not born from unity, but from conflict within a people still defining themselves. The struggle was not only to defeat Britain, but to persuade neighbors, to assert legitimacy, to claim the moral high ground in a divided land. The cause of independence had to compete in the marketplace of loyalties, often under the shadow of violence. In recognizing the Revolution as a civil war, we see its cost more clearly. We understand that the birth of a nation required more than battlefield victories. It demanded personal decisions that fractured communities and reshaped lives. It required ordinary individuals to choose sides in a moment when certainty was scarce, and consequences were permanent. In the mythology of the American founding, victory can feel inevitable. The Revolution appears as a steady march from protest to triumph, from bold declaration to final surrender at Siege of Yorktown. Yet the lived reality was far more fragile. The Revolution nearly collapsed multiple times, hanging by threads so thin that a single misstep, a harsher winter, a delayed ship, or a wavering general might have ended the experiment before it began. In the summer of 1776, as the Declaration proclaimed independence in Philadelphia, British forces assembled one of the largest expeditionary armies ever sent across the Atlantic. Warships darkened the waters around New York. Seasoned British regulars, supported by Hessian mercenaries, prepared to crush what London still regarded as a rebellion. Against them stood an inexperienced Continental Army, led by George Washington, a commander admired for his character, but untested at the scale of war. The campaign for New York was a disaster. At the Battle of Long Island, American lines broke under disciplined assault. Retreat followed retreat, across Brooklyn, across Manhattan, northward through Harlem Heights and White Plains. Washington's army dwindled as enlistments expired and soldiers slipped away to protect their homes. By December, the Continental Army had been pushed across New Jersey, chased relentlessly toward the Delaware River. The cause of independence, declared with such eloquence only months earlier, seemed on the verge of extinction. Morale collapsed. Civilians who had supported rebellion began to reconsider. British commanders offered pardons to those who would swear loyalty to the crown. Some accepted. The revolutionary flame flickered in icy winds. Washington wrote privately of the Army's desperate condition, aware that a single decisive defeat could shatter the fragile unity of the colonies. The daring crossing of the Delaware and the surprise attack at Trenton offered a spark of hope, but even that victory was precarious. Supplies remained scarce. The Army lacked adequate clothing and ammunition. Disease stalked the camps with greater efficiency than British bayonets. Smallpox, dysentery, and fever reduced ranks faster than combat. In an era before modern sanitation and medicine, military encampments became breeding grounds for suffering. The winter of 1770-1778 at Valley Forge revealed how close the revolution came to dissolving. Contrary to popular memory, the soldiers did not freeze en masse, but they endured relentless hardship. Many lacked shoes, bloody footprints marked the frozen ground, food shortages left men weak, desertion remained a constant threat. Some officers questioned Washington's leadership. Political factions in Congress whispered about replacing him. The so-called Conway cabal hinted at intrigue within the revolutionary leadership itself. The Continental Congress struggled to finance the war. Without the power to tax effectively under the Articles of Confederation, it relied on requisitions from states that were often slow or unwilling to comply. Paper currency depreciated rapidly, fueling inflation that burdened civilians and soldiers alike. Farmers hesitated to sell goods for nearly worthless notes. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," entered common speech, a testament to the financial instability that undermined the war effort. Beyond material shortages lay strategic uncertainty. British forces captured Philadelphia in 1777, dealing a psychological blow. The capital of rebellion fell, and with it came doubts about the movement's durability. Some Americans feared that independence might prove to be a reckless gamble, leading only to devastation and disorder. The turning point at Battle of Saratoga brought critical foreign recognition, but even that victory emerged from a context of peril. Had American forces failed there, France might have withheld support. Without French alliance, the war's outcome would have been starkly different. The revolution's survival depended not only on battlefield courage, but on diplomatic timing and international calculation. In the southern colonies, the war took another dangerous turn. British strategy shifted toward the Carolinas and Georgia, where Loyalist support appeared stronger. Charleston fell in 1780 in one of the worst American defeats of the war. An entire Continental Army was captured. The loss stunned Patriot morale and emboldened British commanders. Guerrilla warfare erupted across the countryside, marked by brutal reprisals and shifting allegiances. The Southern theater exposed again how thin the line was between endurance and collapse. Even within the Continental Army, patience wore thin. Officers went unpaid for months, sometimes years. They watched Congress debate while their families struggled at home. In 1783, as peace negotiations advanced, frustration culminated in the Newburgh Conspiracy. Some officers contemplated using the Army's leverage to demand overdue compensation, hinting at the possibility of military intervention in civil government. It was a moment of profound danger for a revolution founded on civilian authority. Throughout these years, victory never felt secure. Each campaign brought new uncertainty. Each winter threatened disintegration. Each political quarrel risked weakening the collective will. The revolution endured not because it moved in a straight line toward triumph, but because it survived repeated brushes with failure. Ordinary soldiers bore the brunt of that uncertainty. Many enlisted for short terms, driven by local loyalties rather than abstract ideology. They left behind farms and families, uncertain whether their sacrifice would yield freedom or ruin. When their enlistment, TS, ended, they often returned home exhausted and disillusioned. Replacing them required constant recruitment efforts, appealing to honor, necessity, and sometimes sheer desperation. Civilians endured their own trials. Inflation eroded savings. British raids destroyed property. Trade disruptions impoverished port cities. The war demanded sacrifice not only in blood but in stability. Patriot leaders understood that public support could evaporate if suffering outweighed hope. The revolution's survival depended on resilience in the face of near defeat. It depended on leaders who absorbed setbacks without surrendering to despair, and on communities that chose persistence over resignation. It depended on chance, on storms that scattered fleets, on intelligence that arrived in time, on alliances forged before it was too late. It depended on the fragile belief that the cost already paid would not be in vain. From the beginning, the American Revolution was never a purely American affair. However fiercely colonial leaders spoke of natural rights and self-government, however passionately farmers and artisans took up arms, the outcome of the war depended on forces far beyond the 13 colonies. Foreign powers, calculating, cautious, and motivated by their own rivalries, helped decide the fate of the revolution. In 1776, the rebellion looked less like the birth of a nation and more like a dangerous gamble. Britain was the most formidable empire in the world, commanding the seas with a navy unmatched in discipline and reach. The Continental Army, by contrast, was underfunded, undersupplied, and untested. Without external support, it was difficult to imagine how the colonies could sustain a prolonged war against such power. Enter France. For decades, France had nursed resentment over its defeat in the 7 Years' War. The 1763 Treaty of Paris had stripped France of significant North American territories and diminished its global prestige. The rise of British dominance weighed heavily on the French monarchy, particularly under Louis XVI. When rebellion erupted in the American colonies, French officials saw opportunity as well as risk. Supporting the insurgents could weaken Britain, restore French influence, and avenge past humiliation. Yet France did not rush openly into alliance. Early assistance came in secret. Through fictitious trading companies and covert channels, French agents supplied gunpowder, muskets, cannon, and funds to the American cause. Without this early material aid, the Continental Army would have struggled even more severely in its formative campaigns. The war effort depended on imported arms. The colonies lacked the industrial capacity to sustain large-scale production. Diplomacy became as vital as any battlefield maneuver. American representatives traveled to Europe seeking recognition and support. Among them was Benjamin Franklin, whose presence in Paris proved invaluable. Franklin cultivated an image of rustic republican virtue that fascinated French society. He attended salons, charmed aristocrats, and navigated court politics with quiet calculation. His mission was simple in theory and monumental in practice: convince France that American independence was not only desirable but viable. France hesitated. To back a failing rebellion would invite war with Britain without meaningful return. French leaders needed proof that the Americans could win significant victories. That proof arrived in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. The American triumph over British General John Burgoyne's army demonstrated that the rebellion possessed strategic coherence and military potential. Saratoga transformed European perception of the conflict. It suggested that Britain could be defeated. In 1778, France formally recognized the United States and entered the war as its ally. This decision altered the balance of power dramatically. French naval forces began to challenge British supremacy at sea. French troops would eventually fight alongside American forces on land. French financial support helped stabilize the revolutionary government, even as it deepened France's own fiscal crisis. The war expanded beyond North America. Battles unfolded in the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and even the Indian Ocean. The American Revolution became one theater in a global contest among empires. Britain was forced to defend multiple fronts, stretching resources thin. What had begun as a colonial rebellion evolved into a worldwide struggle for dominance. Spain soon joined the conflict, allied with France, though not formally recognizing American independence. Spanish forces targeted British positions along the Gulf Coast and in the Mississippi Valley. Their campaigns diverted British attention and contributed to the erosion of imperial strength in North America. The Dutch Republic, drawn in by commercial tensions with Britain, provided additional complications for British strategy. Foreign officers also played critical roles within the Continental Army. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman inspired by Enlightenment ideals, volunteered his service and became a trusted aide to Washington. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, brought discipline and standardized training to American troops at Valley Forge. These men were not merely romantic figures. They transmitted tactical knowledge and international legitimacy to a fledgling army struggling to professionalize. Naval power proved decisive. For much of the war, British command of the sea allowed them to transport troops, resupply forces, and strike along the coastline at will. American forces lacked a navy capable of direct confrontation. French fleets began to contest that dominance. In 1781, French Admiral de Grasse sailed to the Chesapeake Bay, blocking British reinforcement and escape routes during the campaign that culminated in the siege of Yorktown. Without French naval intervention, British General Cornwallis might have withdrawn or received reinforcements. Instead, he found himself encircled. The surrender at Yorktown did not end the war instantly, but it shattered British political will. Parliament faced mounting costs, global commitments, and diminishing prospects of suppressing the rebellion. The American victory owed much to the convergence of American persistence and foreign intervention. It was not solely the triumph of colonial militias, but the product of international coordination. Yet foreign support was not purely altruistic. France pursued its own strategic interests. Weakening Britain was paramount. The alliance came with expectations and negotiations. American leaders had to balance gratitude with caution, wary of trading one dependency for another. Diplomatic maneuvering continued through peace talks in Paris, where American negotiators sought favorable terms even while technically allied with France. The global dimension of the revolution reveals a sobering truth. Independence was secured not only through courage and conviction, but through alignment with broader geopolitical currents. The colonies did not defeat Britain in isolation. They became part of a larger rivalry among European powers. leveraging imperial competition to secure their own autonomy. This international entanglement carried long-term consequences. France's costly involvement in the war contributed to its financial crisis, which in turn intensified domestic unrest leading toward the French Revolution. The American struggle for independence thus reverberated across the Atlantic, influencing events far beyond its original scope. The Revolution's success hinged on timing, persuasion, and the willingness of foreign courts to gamble against Britain. Had Saratoga ended differently, had French fleets failed to arrive, had European politics shifted in another direction, the rebellion might have faltered. The fate of the United States rested not only in colonial assemblies and American battlefields, but in royal courts, naval councils and diplomatic salons an ocean away. In the summer of 1776, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to approve words that would echo across centuries. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was a sentence luminous in its promise, revolutionary in its scope. Yet even as the ink dried, the contradiction was plain. Liberty was declared, but it was not delivered to all. Many of the men who signed the Declaration owned enslaved human beings. Among them was Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the document. Jefferson wrote eloquently of equality while holding hundreds of people in bondage at Monticello. He understood the moral tension. In an early draft of the Declaration, he condemned the transatlantic slave trade, only to see the passage removed to maintain unity among the colonies. The Revolution demanded solidarity, and solidarity came at the expense of confronting slavery directly. For enslaved African Americans, the Revolution presented both peril and possibility. British officials recognized an opportunity to destabilize the rebellion. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved men who escaped rebel masters and joined British forces. Thousands responded, seeking liberty not through patriot rhetoric but through imperial promise. Others fought on the American side, persuaded that the language of rights might one day extend to them. Black soldiers served at battles from Bunker Hill to Yorktown. Some fought in integrated units, others in segregated companies. They risked their lives for a cause that did not yet fully recognize their humanity. In northern states, gradual emancipation laws began to emerge in the wake of the Revolution, reflecting a growing unease with slavery's contradiction. Yet in the South, slavery expanded, entrenching itself more deeply into the economic and social fabric of the new nation. For Native American nations, the Revolution's promise of liberty carried little solace. Many tribes saw the British Crown as a potential barrier against colonial expansion. Proclamation lines had once limited westward settlement, however imperfectly enforced. When war erupted, numerous native nations allied with Britain, calculating that imperial authority might better protect their lands. The Revolution thus became a struggle not only between colonies and empire, but over the future of the continent itself. American victory altered that balance irrevocably. With British power diminished, westward expansion accelerated. Treaties were signed and broken. Lands were seized. Indigenous communities faced displacement, violence, and fragmentation. The language of liberty did not shield them from dispossession. The new republic pursued growth with urgency, often at the expense of those who had inhabited the land long before independence was declared. Women, too, experienced the Revolution's paradox. They organized boycotts, managed farms and businesses in their husbands' absence, and contributed to the war effort as nurses, fundraisers, and political voices. Figures such as Abigail Adams urged leaders to remember the ladies as new laws were crafted. Yet political rights remained largely closed to women. The Revolution expanded conversations about education and civic virtue for women, but it did not grant them suffrage or formal equality. The rhetoric of natural rights inspired broader reflection on authority and hierarchy. Religious minorities gained greater freedom in some states as established churches lost power. Property requirements for voting were gradually reduced in certain regions, expanding participation among white men. The Revolution unsettled traditional structures, creating space for reform. Yet its transformation was partial and uneven. The contradiction between principle and practice haunted the early republic. How could a nation founded on equality sustain human bondage? How could it proclaim universal rights while restricting them along lines of race and gender? These questions did not disappear after independence, they intensified. The Revolution opened a door to debate that would define American politics for generations. Some founders recognized the fragility of their compromise. They feared that slavery contradicted the very ideals that justified rebellion. Yet economic dependency and regional divisions limited their willingness to act decisively. Unity against Britain had required sidestepping the issue. After the war, the urgency of national cohesion continued to shape decisions. Compromises embedded slavery into the constitutional framework, postponing resolution. The Revolution thus became both a beacon and a burden. Its words inspired abolitionists, reformers, and suffragists in the decades that followed. Activists cited the Declaration's promise as evidence that the nation had fallen short of its own creed. The same document that tolerated exclusion also fueled movements for inclusion. The Revolution's ideals became tools of critique as well as celebration. Enslaved individuals invoked revolutionary language in petitions for freedom. Black communities formed churches and institutions grounded in the belief that liberty belonged to them as much as to any citizen. Native leaders negotiated, resisted, and adapted in a landscape transformed by American independence. Women organized for educational opportunities and legal reforms, laying groundwork for future suffrage movements. The Revolution did not resolve these contradictions. It illuminated them. By declaring universal principles, it created a standard against which injustice could be measured. By failing to apply those principles universally, it set the stage for struggle. The promise of equality became a horizon toward which generations would move, sometimes haltingly, sometimes defiantly. In the years after independence, debates over slavery, citizenship, and rights intensified. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in new territories north of the Ohio River, signaling one direction. The expansion of cotton cultivation in the South signaled another. The Constitution balanced competing interests, embedding compromise into the nation's foundation. The Revolution's language endured even as its application remained contested. Liberty, declared in soaring prose, proved uneven in distribution. The Revolution expanded political imagination while constraining immediate change. It offered a vocabulary of rights that transcended its own limitations. The gap between ideal and reality did not diminish the power of the words, it magnified their significance. The Declaration's claim that all are created equal would echo through abolitionist tracts. Civil rights speeches and suffrage conventions invoked by those excluded from its first embrace. Revolutions are often remembered for the moment power changes hands. The storming of a fortress, the fall of a monarch, the triumphant march of a new order rising from the ashes of the old. Yet the American Revolution's most are. The Attical Act was not the overthrow of British authority. It was the decision not to replace one king with another. The greatest victory was restraining power, not seizing it. In the 18th century, monarchy was the norm. Authority flowed downward from crowned heads, sanctioned by tradition and, many believed, by God. The colonists did not initially demand independence. They demanded rights within the empire. But as conflict escalated, they confronted a deeper question. If they rejected the authority of George III, what would take its place? War creates opportunities for ambition. Armies look to strong leaders. Crisis invites concentration of power. In 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was given extraordinary authority, command over troops, strategic decisions, and the fate of the rebellion itself. For 8 years, he led soldiers through desperation and triumph. In many nations, such a figure might have emerged from war as a ruler for life. Washington understood the danger. He had studied history, including the fall of republics that succumbed to military strongmen. He knew that a revolution fought in the name of liberty could easily give birth to tyranny if ambition outpaced principle. Throughout the war, he deferred to civilian authority, even when Congress faltered. He endured criticism, shortages, and political intrigue without resorting to force against his own government. In 1783, as the war drew to a close, a profound test emerged. Officers stationed in Newburgh, New York, frustrated by unpaid wages and uncertain pensions, contemplated collective action. Some hinted at marching on Congress. Anonymous letters circulated suggesting that only a show of strength would secure justice. The atmosphere crackled with resentment. A restless army hardened by years of sacrifice stood on the edge. Of insubordination, Washington addressed his officers in what became known as the Newburgh Address. He appealed not to their anger, but to their honor. Producing a letter from Congress, he paused and reached for spectacles few had seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he said, "you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." The gesture, simple and human, reminded them of shared sacrifice. The conspiracy dissolved. The Army did not turn on the republic it had fought to create. Weeks later, in Annapolis, Washington resigned his commission before the Continental Congress. The act stunned observers across the Atlantic. A victorious general voluntarily relinquishing power was rare in the annals of history. George III reportedly remarked that if Washington truly did so, he would be the greatest man in the world. By stepping aside, Washington affirmed that the revolution's purpose was not to elevate a single man, but to establish a system where authority derived from the people, yet the restraint of power extended beyond Washington. After independence, the United States faced chaos under the Articles of Confederation. The central government lacked the power to tax effectively or regulate commerce. States quarreled. Economic turmoil bred unrest. Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts revealed how fragile order could be. Some Americans feared that liberty without structure would dissolve into anarchy. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 convened in Philadelphia to address these weaknesses. Delegates debated fiercely over how much authority to grant a new national government. They feared both tyranny and disorder. The resulting Constitution reflected a deliberate architecture of restraint, checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism. No single branch would dominate. Ambition would counteract ambition. Authority would be distributed and limited. The presidency itself was crafted with caution. Delegates rejected proposals for a lifetime executive. They established fixed terms and the possibility of impeachment. The office would wield significant power, but it would operate within boundaries. The memory of monarchy lingered as both warning and lesson. When Washington was elected the first president under the new Constitution, his conduct again defined precedent. He sought consensus within his cabinet, respected congressional authority, and declined suggestions of perpetual leadership. After 2 terms, he stepped down voluntarily, establishing an informal tradition that endured until the 20th century. By refusing a 3rd term, he reinforced the principle that even beloved leaders must yield to constitutional order. Restraint also occurred in the peaceful transfer of power between political rivals. The election of 1800, which brought Thomas Jefferson to the presidency, tested the young republic. Partisan tensions ran high. Accusations flew. Yet when the votes were settled, power shifted without violence. The government did not fracture. It endured. The revolution's promise found expression not in dramatic upheaval, but in procedural continuity. The emphasis on restraining power did not eliminate conflict or injustice. The new republic struggled with slavery, indigenous displacement, and political division, yet the framework allowed for amendment, debate, and reform. Authority could be challenged within institutions rather than through constant revolution. The American Revolution's distinctiveness lies in this paradox. It was radical in rejecting monarchy, yet conservative in its suspicion of concentrated authority. It distrusted unchecked power, whether wielded by king, parliament, or popular majority. It sought liberty not in chaos, but in balanced governance. Across history, revolutions have often devoured themselves, replacing one despot with another. The American experiment charted a different course. Its leaders recognized that the temptation to dominate could undo everything they claimed to defend. By surrendering military command, by embedding checks into constitutional design, by accepting electoral defeat, they demonstrated that the true measure of victory was not control, but constraint. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.